Poetry. I've already shown you some of this stuff, but I wanted to make sure that everybody remembered some of these terms. So, this is the Romantic period of time. In England, it starts in the 1700s, about halfway through 1750-ish. In America, it starts a little bit later than that, mostly because we're busy fighting this war. Um, so, in the 1800s, in America, we begin the Romantic movement. Um, it goes from 1800 to 1900. Again, in England, it starts earlier, arguably continues for about the same length until about 1900. But there are a couple things that get in the way. In America, we had this Civil War from 1861 to 65, and that made poets think a little bit differently. And then World War One comes along and just pretty much kills off Romanticism. Well, why is Romanticism something that gets killed off by wars? Let's have a look. So the tendency of the Romantic period. There's a cool article in Schmoop that you can check out. I've left this on your Google Classroom, so you can follow this link. But one of the things, especially for the Americans, is the Romantic movement is inspired by nature. So you see Romantic poets going out into nature to get inspired, and then the things that they write about often are actually things that they see in nature, as we'll see in the poems we look at. This concept of pantheism means that you can find God everywhere. So for the nature poet, that means, you go out to a river and that's where God is. You go out, you look at a bird, God is in the bird. You look at the ocean, God is in the ocean. God is in the fish, God is in the shells. And probably most important, God is in every human being, including everyone's self. So if we want to get in touch with God, we need to get in touch with our own soul. Um, and that brings us to a commitment to individualism. So people are supposed to, in the romantic imagination, look inward to find God, to be themselves, because that's where we find everything true about ourselves, everything true about the universe. There's also a sense of feelings as being super, super, super important. The 1700s are known as the age of reason. In the 1800s, there's a little bit of a black backlash against this commitment, this need to know everything, and more of a desire to get in touch with feelings. The 1700s are the period where industrialization begins to happen, where we have the invention of the steam engine, where we have the beginning of factory production, especially again in England. Um, this romantic movement is a little bit of a backlash to all that, and it's an idea that instead of working in packing ourselves into cities, working in factories, being parts of teams that produce goods, we ought to be out exploring nature, getting to know ourselves. Um, and there's a tendency for symbolism. And you'll notice that all of the poems, or at least many of the poems we're going to look at from the Romantic period, are very, very, very focused on a single symbol. Um, in fact, many are extended metaphors. Um, for the poems, I've got a collection of three poems that are called Epiphany poems. I call them Epiphany poems. The concept of Epiphany, it comes from the name of a holiday, the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles as represented by the Magi. Um, the Magi were the three wise men who came to see Jesus as soon as he was born. These wise men recognized immediately that Jesus was um, a very, very, very important figure. They arguably, well, according to the Bible, recognized him as the new Son of God, the Messiah. Um, and this recognition of something that is very, very important is known as an epiphany. So, for the purposes of these poems, we're looking at this second definition, a moment of sudden and great revelation. Um, so, there, there is a moment in all of these poems where there is something discovered. And in all of these poems, that something comes from nature. So we've got these poems. I've actually, rather than have you look at those, I've made a copy for everybody um, of all of the romantic poems. And I call it group two. I actually did it first. But we remember in this poem, To a Waterfowl, as I mentioned down here in the notes, um, a waterfowl is a duck or a goose. And the epiphany here is the poet recognizes that this waterfowl knows where it's going. And it knows where it's going because it only listens inward. So there's this stanza here. There is a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast. It looks at that migrating bird and it says, wow, this bird flies hundreds or even maybe 1,000 miles every year and it doesn't get lost. And we have this nice rhyme, coast and lost. Um, so this power teaches the bird where to go. Well, we could say that power is nature. We could say that power is God. The romantic probably wouldn't care either way, um, because the romantics were really uh, they really liked this idea of pantheism. So it could be God, it could be nature, it could be the oversoul, as Emerson said. But whatever that power is, it guides this duck. And the poet says, gee, if I could be like that duck, I would always know where to go. And the metaphor of where to go in this case is to know what to do. So he who from zone to zone guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight in the long way that I must trace alone will lead my steps aright. Now remember, I mentioned in the sort of introduction to all this that romantics were all about the individual. Well, look at this, in the long way that I must trace alone. When we have people who are alone, that is a great suggestion that this is going to be a romantic poem, especially if after being alone they come to some kind of epiphany or discovery or find some comfort in being alone. So that's the concept here. Now, mechanically, this poem is put together in a very disciplined way. You'll notice, just looking at the rhymes, brink rhymes with sink, wide rhymes with side. And so it's A, B, every single stanza. You'll also notice that the lines are not all the same length. There is a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast, the desert and illimitable air, lone wandering but not lost. So the desert and illimitable air, that's a five syllable or 5 beat line. It's iambic pentameter, as is this one, teaches thy way along the pathless coast. So, and then the first and the last line are shorter. There is a power whose care, lone wandering but not lost. So we've got 3 beats here, 5 beats here, 5 beats here, 3 beats here. Same over here, and in every other stanza. He who from zone to zone, again, 3 beats, sorry, 3 beats. He who from zone to zone, or he who from zone to zone, guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight. Again, 5 beats. In the long way that I must trace alone. Sorry, but it's 5 beats. Trust me on that. And then will lead my steps aright. Another 3. So this poem is crafted in a certain way, and the rhymes help us to understand it. So anyway, there are structural things happening here, as well as the thematic things. All right, back. let's look at this next one, a noiseless patient spider. So this is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman. And again, um, notice that this poet, we don't know for sure that the poet is all by itself, but there's a pretty good indication that he is, especially where we look this, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space. So the poet here clearly feels, when he's talking to his soul as alone, he's looking at a spider. And the spider is all by itself, as spiders generally are when we see them. And it's standing on a little promontory or a cliff. Of course, a cliff could be anything for a spider, could be the edge of a gutter, um, or a branch or something. So, a noiseless patient spider I marked where on a little promontory it stood, isolated. There's that isolation again, that solitariness. I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. So the spider leaps off of this cliff, and by spinning itself, by letting out this thread, it connects itself to other things. And this is what he exhorts his own soul to do. He says, "And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul." The poet here looks at this idea of being lonely and says the only way that you can connect is by launching yourself out. I really love this poem. These are the notes to think about here. You know, what if anybody can look at this poem and say, "Gee, how could I be like that spider?" So that's another one to look at. And then we've got down here the chambered nautilus. Now, unlike Whitman, who wrote in free verse, although this free verse has some patterns that are pretty clear, but nevertheless, it doesn't have the rhyme scheme that we're used to seeing. It doesn't have the really fixed meter. Um, this is back to that old school. Every stanza follows the same pattern. So all of these stanzas are very, very patterned, very, very organized. Um, but this guy, this poet, imagines, or doesn't imagine, sees a chambered nautilus. And I've got a photo here for you to check out. It's right up here. So this is a chambered nautilus shell. And what's going on here is you've got a creature that lives here in the outward compartment. And it lives here in this section. And what happens is when it's born, it's very small. And it gradually, gradually, gradually builds out. And so let's say it's at this point. Well, that's before all this part of the shell is there. So when it's at this point, it dedicates itself to building more shell, and then eventually it builds it sort of out here, and then it seals that part, and then it lives in the new one. And then it makes a new one, it makes a whole new external piece, and then leaves the old one. So it keeps on building bigger and bigger and bigger chambers. And finally, it lives in this in this last one, and then eventually the creature dies and leaves behind this magnificent shell. So, Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he writes his poem, he sees this shell and he says, "Boy, oh boy, if we could only live like that, if we could only be growing and growing." Well, the part that he wants to grow, I mean, clearly our bodies grow as we get older, they also shrink as we get older. Um, but he's looking at the idea of the chambered nautilus as a metaphor for one's life and one's accomplishments. Um, and the creature that's in that he sees as the soul, the human soul. So he says in the end, "Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul." By the way, that "O my soul" line also shows up in Whitman. Whitman is after Holmes, so you could suggest that he borrowed that line, but see, it's right there, "O my soul." And here too, "O my soul." In this one, he says he speaks to his soul. By the way, if you're speaking to his soul, he's speaking to somebody who can't hear. Um, that's a literary device, and we know that that's called apostrophe. So build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll. Leave thy low vaulted past. Let each new temple, nobler than the last, shut thee from heaven with a dome more vast, till thou at length art free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. Um, of course, Holmes left great poems. He also left a very distinguished career as a Supreme Court justice behind. So he did a lot of things with his life. And this is the idea here that we want to grow and we want to experience, we want to build things with our lives. So that's Oliver Wendell Holmes, and that's the last of the Epiphany poems. Then I've got these three at the top. "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud," and "The Tiger," and "Ozymandias." These are three great poems. Um, so I'll talk about those momentarily. Thanks for checking it out. I hope you enjoyed it.